My drunk mom gave us a New Year surprise. She started showing my embarrassing wife the right baby-making positions. Honestly, that awful honeymoon turned out pretty sweet. I was always her kid. Not her son, her kid. Even in high school. No matter how much taller I grew or how deep my voice got, to my mother, I was still that little boy who needed his face wiped and his hair combed just so. She was everywhere, at my parent-teacher meetings, my sports games, even the few times I dared invite a girl over. She had an uncanny ability to swoop in at the wrong moment, a sixth sense honed to perfection. "Is that lip gloss I smell?" she'd tease, popping into the room uninvited. "How nice. Maybe I should offer her one of my scarves. It's chilly outside." I'd die a little inside each time. Sex. Parties. None of that was on the table with Mom lurking around. She liked to remind me that good boys didn't waste their energy on distractions. And maybe I believed her a little too much, because by the time I hit senior year, I was still the guy who had curfews, got lectures about life choices, and hadn't so much as held a girl's hand for more than a fleeting second. But it wasn't all bad. My mom was my safety net. Whenever I needed anything, advice, money for a field trip, a ride home after I missed the bus, she was there. And not in a grudging, "I have to because I'm your mom" way. She did it like she genuinely loved being needed. That's what made it so complicated. She wasn't overbearing in the cartoonish way some people might think. No, my mom knew how to make her presence feel helpful, necessary even. It wasn't until much later that I realized her generosity often came with strings attached. Looking back, I wonder if she was just lonely. My dad had never been the warmest person, and their marriage functioned more like a polite business partnership than a love story. Maybe I became her way of filling the gaps. But as much as I sympathized with her, it didn't make being the center of her universe any easier. She could be relentless. Once, when I told her I didn't want to do the mother-son dance at my senior prom, because, I wanted to actually dance with someone my own age, she spent the entire week dropping comments about how sons these days didn't appreciate their mothers anymore. When the big night came, I caved. We danced. At the time, I thought I was just being kind. Now, I see it for what it was. Her mastery at guilting me into prioritizing her feelings over my own. I didn't fight her much. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. And when I got married years later, it didn't cross my mind that any of this would become a problem. After all, my mother always said she wanted me to find a good woman. I thought she'd be happy. I thought she'd let go. Turns out, I thought wrong. I loved my mom, I really did. But the truth was, she was an unstoppable force that no husband or boyfriend could ever seem to endure. She had this need to be in control, to have the final say in everything, and that made relationships with her complicated. That's putting it kindly. It wasn't that she didn't try, she did. But she had this habit of taking matters into her own hands, sometimes quite literally, in ways that left her partners feeling emasculated and powerless. My dad used to joke, bitterly, that Mom didn't let a man be a man. I didn't understand what he meant when I was younger. But over the years, as I watched her cycle through relationships, the pattern became glaringly obvious. One time, her boyfriend Frank, a burly mechanic with hands like tree stumps, was trying to fix the washing machine. It wasn't going well. I remember him crouched on the floor, surrounded by tools and muttering curses under his breath. Mom stood over him, arms crossed, watching him struggle. Then, without so much as a warning, she shoved him aside, grabbed the wrench, and fixed the damn thing herself. "It's not that hard," she said, handing him the wrench with a smirk. Frank didn't last long after that. And that's just how she was, with men and everyone else. Neighbors, friends, even strangers weren't safe from her need to dominate. It wasn't malicious. She wasn't mean for the sake of being mean. It was more like she just couldn't help herself. She had this unshakable belief that if she didn't take charge, everything would fall apart. At first, the neighbors seemed to like her. It was easy to be charmed by her boldness, her confidence. She'd show up in the garage where the men tinkered with their cars, uninvited but somehow welcome. My mom knew her stuff. She could talk about carburetors, spark plugs, and transmission fluid with the best of them. Her knowledge made her an honorary member of their little club. But it didn't last. Her garage visits started with friendly advice. "Hey, maybe you should tighten that belt a little more," or "You're using the wrong size socket wrench." Then it turned into criticism. How many times do I have to tell you that's not how you fix a timing chain? Or, honestly, I don't know how any of you get anything done in here. Before long, she wasn't just giving advice, she was taking over. She'd snatch tools out of their hands, point out their mistakes with an almost gleeful precision, and boss them around like she owned the place. One by one, the men started dropping out. First it was old Pete, who claimed he was too busy to come to the garage anymore, but was really just tired of being told he didn't know his way around an engine. Then there was Joe, who used to come every Saturday until he started spending his weekends at the bar instead. By the time she was done, the garage was empty. Mom had one, but at what cost? I heard whispers from the wives and girlfriends in the neighborhood, stories of how their husbands came home defeated, nursing bruised egos and bottles of cheap whiskey. She drives them mad, one of them said, not knowing I was within earshot. It's like she has to prove she's better than them at everything. And maybe she did. She didn't see it that way, of course. To her, she was just helping, just making things better. But her help came with a price, a kind of unrelenting pressure that most people couldn't handle. I didn't fully understand it as a kid. To me, she was just Mom, the woman who fixed everything and always knew what to do. But as I got older, I began to see her through the eyes of the people around her, the husbands who left, the neighbors who avoided her, and the men in the garage who quietly disappeared. It wasn't until much later that I realized how lonely she must have been, even surrounded by all that chaos she created. When the men of our town stopped gathering in garages, everything changed. It was slow at first. Pete didn't show up one Saturday, then Joe found an excuse to skip the next week. Before long, the garage was quiet, its smell of motor oil and the faint crackle of a radio replaced by silence. The men had given up. They had no passion left for fixing up old cars or arguing over which carburetor worked best for Ed's truck. They'd been beaten, though they'd never admit it. And my mom, she was the victor, though she didn't even realize there had been a fight. It wasn't just that my mom was better than them at fixing cars, she was the best. She grew up in grease-stained overalls, trailing behind her father, my grandfather, who was a legend in his own right. He'd started at the bottom, fixing up beat-up sedans and rusty pickup trucks, but through sheer grit and talent, he clawed his way to the top. By the time Mom was 10, he was working with Formula One racers, spending his days with roaring engines and sleek machines that looked more like fighter jets than cars. Grandpa took her everywhere, teaching her the craft as if she were his apprentice. While other kids were playing hopscotch or watching cartoons, my mom was learning about camshafts and torque. She could name every part of an engine by the time she was 12, and by 14, she could rebuild a transmission faster than most grown men. She idolized him. To her, Grandpa was the gold standard, the ultimate example of what hard work and raw talent could achieve. She held him up as a shining beacon of what she could become, and, if you asked her, what everyone else should strive to be. So, it wasn't enough for her to be good at fixing cars. She had to be the best, just like her dad. She couldn't just let the men in the garage have their fun, even if their knowledge was patchy and their work sloppy. She had to step in, to make sure they knew she was the authority. But in doing so, she took away their joy. Fixing up cars wasn't just a hobby for them, it was their escape, their one place to feel useful and proud. When she poked and prodded, pointing out every mistake, it was like she'd drained all the fun out of it. Around the same time, the factory started laying people off. Men who'd spent their whole lives working with their hands suddenly found themselves with nothing to do. No jobs, no purpose, and now, no garage to gather in. They started drifting to Ed's pub instead, drowning their sorrows in cheap beer and whiskey. That might have been the end of it, a sad story of men losing their way and finding solace at the bottom of a glass. But Mom wasn't done yet. If they were going to abandon their wrenches for whiskey, she'd make sure they did it with some class. She signed up for a sommelier course at the community college, a move that left the whole town scratching their heads. A sommelier? For someone who used to pride herself on having motor oil under her nails? But that was Mom. If there was a new challenge, she was the first to meet it head-on. It wasn't just about learning to swirl wine in a glass and talk about tannins. No, this was her way of asserting herself in yet another domain. If the men thought they could escape her by hiding out at the pub, they were wrong. She'd stroll in, confident as ever, armed with her newfound knowledge of wine and her unrelenting drive to be number one. At first, it was just to show them up. She'd critique their beer choices, make offhand comments about palates and pairings. But then, somehow, she started making the pub her domain too. Ed's became her stage. She'd host tastings, offer unsolicited lessons on wine regions and grape varieties, and turn casual nights at the bar into lectures. And the men. They didn't know what to make of it. Some tried to push back, but it was useless. Mom had the same iron grip on the pub as she'd had on the garage. It didn't make them happier. If anything, they grew quieter, their drinks dulling the edges of their frustration. They couldn't hate her, not entirely. She was too good at what she did. But they couldn't love her either. She was too much, too relentless, too everything. And Mom? She couldn't see it. Or maybe she did, but she didn't care. After all, she was just like her dad, always first, always the best. And if that left a trail of empty garages and deflated men in her wake, so be it. It started small, like most things do. At first, it was just tastings. A sip here, a swirl there, comparing notes with her classmates from the sommelier course. She'd bring home a bottle of something fancy now and then, eager to share what she'd learned. "Close your eyes and tell me what you taste," she'd say, sliding a glass across the table toward me. "Hints of oak. Maybe blackberry. No, wait. Blackcurrant." I'd humor her, of course. But the truth was, wine tasted like wine to me. Sweet, bitter, dry, it all blurred together. Still, she loved it, and I figured it was harmless enough. Then came the blind tastings. She'd pour 2 glasses, comparing a cheap $10 bottle to one that cost more than our weekly groceries. "You need to train your palate," she'd say. "Otherwise, what's the point of drinking at all?" I thought she was joking. Looking back, maybe she wasn't. The shift was gradual. Wine started appearing at dinner, not just on special occasions, but every night. At first, it was a glass. Then 2. Soon enough, I realized Mom wasn't drinking water anymore. Wine had become her companion at every meal, her way of unwinding after the day. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, she was still sharp, still running circles around everyone, still Mom. But step by step, it crept in. I'd find empty bottles in the recycling bin, more than 1 or 2. The corkscrew lived permanently on the kitchen counter, and her wine glasses always seemed freshly rinsed. It became her escape, though she'd never admit it. For someone like her, someone who had to be in control of everything and everyone, she couldn't stomach the thought of talking to a psychologist. Opening up to someone, letting herself be vulnerable, it wasn't an option. Not for her. So, instead, she drank. I think the wine helped her quiet the chaos in her mind, at least for a little while. For all her bravado and confidence, I could tell there was something deeper, something restless beneath the surface. She carried the weight of being the best, of living up to her father's legacy, of always being on. But she couldn't keep it together. Not forever. The cracks started to show in small ways. She'd forget things, a rare occurrence for her, or lose her temper over nothing. She was quick to brush it off, to act like everything was fine, but I saw it. One night, as she reached for her 3rd glass of wine, I asked, "Mom, don't you think you've had enough?" She froze, the glass hovering mid-air. For a moment, I thought she might actually answer. Instead, she just laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Enough," she said, taking a sip. "Enough is for quitters." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just drinking to enjoy it anymore. She was drinking to escape. And it scared me. It wasn't long before I started seeing the signs. They were small at first, subtle cracks in her impenetrable armor. My mom was always the woman who had every answer, the person who could fix any problem before anyone even realized it existed. But now, her fixes were starting to look like patchwork. She forgot things, appointments, conversations we'd had, even small promises she'd made. Once, she promised to pick up groceries, only to come home with nothing but 2 bottles of wine and a half-hearted shrug. "Guess I forgot," she said, brushing past me and disappearing into the kitchen. It wasn't like her to be so careless, and that's what scared me. My mom didn't forget. She didn't let things slip. She was the person who reminded me when I left my keys on the counter or forgot to send out a bill. Seeing her so scattered felt like watching a pillar crack under its own weight. I told myself she was just tired. Stressed. She had a lot on her plate, after all. But deep down, I knew better. The day she threw a glass across the room was the day I realized something was deeply wrong. We were sitting at the kitchen table, arguing about something stupid, probably about her drinking, though I couldn't even remember what exactly set her off. One moment she was fine, and the next, she was standing, shouting, her face twisted in a way I'd never seen before. Then the glass was in her hand, and before I could even react, it smashed against the wall behind me, sending shards scattering across the floor. I froze, stunned into silence. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, her hand still outstretched like she couldn't believe what she'd just done. Then, just as quickly as the storm had come, it was gone. "Clean that up," she said, her voice icy and calm, like nothing had happened. I didn't move. I just stared at her, at this woman I suddenly didn't recognize. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of her. The next morning, she acted like nothing was wrong. She was back to her usual self, all charm and confidence, pouring her first glass of wine before noon like it was no big deal. "You need help," I told her, my voice trembling. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, waving me off. "I'm serious, Mom. You need to talk to someone. A psychologist, a counselor, anyone." The moment I said the word psychologist, her entire demeanor shifted. She set the wine glass down with a deliberate clink and turned to face me. "I don't need a shrink," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Why not? They could help." I said no, she snapped, cutting me off. Her eyes burned with a fury I hadn't seen since the glass-throwing incident. "I'm not some weak little thing who needs to sit on a couch and cry about my feelings. I'm fine. Do you understand me? Fine." She wasn't fine, though. She was unraveling, and the scariest part was that she couldn't, or wouldn't, see it. She clung to control like a lifeline, refusing to admit that the weight of everything she carried was crushing her. But I saw it. I saw it in the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, in the way she poured herself another glass as soon as the last one was empty, in the way her laughter sounded more and more forced every day. I didn't know what to do. I was her son, but I felt powerless to help her. And worse, I felt like she wouldn't let me if I tried. For a while, I let myself forget about my mom and all the chaos that came with her. It was snowing the day I left for a new job in the country, a fresh start that I didn't even know I needed. The town was small, tucked away in a valley surrounded by endless stretches of white fields. It felt quiet in a way I hadn't experienced before, peaceful, like the world had pressed pause. That's where I met Michelle. She worked at the local library, her dark hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, her hands dusted with the smell of old books. She wasn't flashy or loud, not the type of person who commanded a room. But she didn't need to. Michelle had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when she spoke to you. We started talking over something as mundane as library cards. By the second conversation, I realized she was everything my mother wasn't. Michelle knew how to assert her boundaries, but there was a kindness to her strength. She didn't bulldoze people or demand control. She listened. She cared. She knew how to stand her ground without making it a battlefield. I didn't believe in love, not really. Not the kind that makes your heart race and your mind reel. But with Michelle, it just happened. Fast. Too fast, if I'm being honest. One moment I was a stranger at the library desk, and the next, I was driving her home from work in the snow, laughing like I hadn't laughed in years. When I told Mom about Michelle, her reaction was predictably sharp. She didn't like her. From the moment I said Michelle's name, my mother decided she was a threat, a usurper. "She's just trying to replace me," Mom said, swirling her wine as she spoke. "Replace you?" I asked, barely holding back my frustration. "Mom, she's not replacing anyone. She's my—" "I don't want to hear it," she snapped. Their first meeting was a disaster. Mom was cold and dismissive, and Michelle, bless her heart, did her best to keep the conversation light, even as Mom threw barbs her way. I was ready to explode by the end of the night, but Michelle took my hand and told me not to worry. "She's scared," Michelle said simply. "She thinks she's losing you." "I'm not a prize to be lost," I muttered. Michelle smiled. "I know that. But maybe she doesn't." To my surprise, it was Michelle who made the first move toward peace. She reached out to my mom, not with demands or ultimatums, but with genuine concern. Michelle could see how much my mom's drinking and volatility were affecting me, and instead of taking offense, she tried to help. They argued. A lot. But eventually, something shifted. Michelle showed up one afternoon with a tray of freshly baked cookies and a soft smile. She told Mom she was worried about her health, that I was worried about her health. I didn't think it would work. I expected Mom to lash out, to reject the concern like she always did. But instead, she softened. It wasn't instant, but it was enough. The fights stopped. The drinking slowed, then stopped altogether. Mom seemed calmer, lighter, like a storm that had finally passed. She was in a better mood, laughing more and hovering less. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if the quiet was just a calm before the next storm. We got married in a small ceremony, just close friends and family, with snow gently falling outside the chapel. Michelle looked radiant, her calm confidence grounding me as always. It felt like a new beginning, not just for us as a couple but for my entire life. After the wedding, I moved into Michelle's cozy house on the edge of town. It wasn't big or extravagant, but it was full of warmth, soft blankets draped over the couch, the smell of fresh bread lingering in the air, and books stacked neatly on every shelf. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Even my relationship with my mom seemed to transform. With Michelle's steady influence, Mom had softened, let down her guard just enough to meet me halfway. They even became friends in their own odd way. Mom taught Michelle how to fix a leaky faucet, and Michelle showed Mom how to make her famous apple pie from scratch. They found common ground, and for a while, it felt like we were all finally at peace. But I should have known better. One day, as Michelle and I were sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by brochures and travel guides, my phone buzzed. We were deep in honeymoon planning mode, tossing ideas back and forth about the Caribbean, Europe, or maybe even a road trip through wine country. Bali, Michelle said, flipping through a glossy catalog. The beaches, the food. It's perfect. I was just about to agree when the phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. I glanced at the screen. Mom, I said, holding up the phone. Give me a sec. Michelle waved me off with a smile, already flipping to another page. Hey, Mom, I answered, leaning back in my chair. Her voice came through, cheery but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Darling, how are you? I hope I'm not interrupting. No, we're just planning the honeymoon, I said, lowering the phone slightly so Michelle wouldn't hear the sigh in my voice. What's up? Well, she began, drawing the word out in a way that instantly put me on edge. I was just thinking about how you and Michelle have such wonderful taste. I bet you're planning something amazing, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I joined you? I froze, the phone pressed against my ear, her words sinking in like cold water. What? Just for a little while, she said quickly, as if rushing through the explanation would make it more palatable. You wouldn't even notice I'm there. I'd keep to myself, maybe even book my own room. It'd be so lovely to spend some time together, like old times. Old times. The phrase made my stomach twist. Mom, it's our honeymoon, I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. Exactly, she chirped, missing, or ignoring, the point entirely. Such a special trip. A celebration for the family, don't you think? Across the table, Michelle looked up, tilting her head in curiosity. I gave her a quick shake of my head, signaling her to wait. Mom, I said slowly, a honeymoon is kind of just for the couple. It's, private. Oh, don't be silly, she said, brushing off my words like dust on a windowsill. I wouldn't intrude. I just think it'd be nice to share some of those beautiful memories with you. I closed my eyes, already feeling the tension start to creep up my spine. This wasn't a request. It was an expectation. And I knew my mom well enough to know that when she had an idea in her head, she wouldn't let it go without a fight. Let me talk to Michelle about it, I muttered, already dreading the conversation to come. As I hung up, Michelle gave me a look, her eyebrows raised in question. What was that about? I sighed, setting the phone down on the table. She wants to come with us. On the honeymoon. Michelle stared at me, her mouth slightly open, and then laughed, a short, incredulous sound. You're joking. I wish I was. Her expression hardened. You're going to tell her no, right? Of course, I said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as they left my mouth. Michelle leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. This is supposed to be our time, not hers. You need to set boundaries, and you need to do it now. I nodded, but the knot in my chest tightened. I thought things had changed. I thought we'd finally moved past this. But here we were, and the line between my mom and my life was blurring again. My mom wouldn't take no for an answer. Once she had an idea in her head, it was like trying to stop a freight train with a piece of string. Despite my protests and Michelle's icy silence, Mom found a way to tag along on our honeymoon. I don't even know how she managed it. One day she was just talking about maybe coming, and the next, she'd booked herself a flight and a room at the same resort. Nothing could stop her. By the time we landed, it already felt less like a honeymoon and more like a bizarre family trip. Mom was waiting for us at the resort's check-in desk, somehow managing to look both delighted and smug as she waved us over. Michelle barely managed a tight smile as we approached. "Oh, there you are," Mom exclaimed, pulling me into a quick hug before turning to Michelle. "And you, my dear. How was the flight? Did you get the snacks I told you about?" "No." "Well, I'll have to speak to someone about that." Michelle's "it was fine" was barely audible over the sound of Mom already chatting up the resort staff. Within minutes, she was telling the receptionist how to speed up the check-in process, commenting on the efficiency of the bellhop system, and critiquing the placement of the concierge desk. It was surreal, watching her slip into her element like that. She had this way of taking over any room she walked into, her voice loud and confident, her presence commanding attention. Before we even got to our room, I heard one of the staff whisper to another, "She's acting like she owns the place." I couldn't blame them. It did feel like she was running the resort within hours of arriving. It was like the good old days, in the worst possible way. She'd found her way into the heart of the resort's operations, chatting up the staff like old friends, handing out advice on everything from menu planning to towel folding. At one point, I swear she was behind the front desk, rearranging reservation files and directing people to their rooms like she was the manager. "She's not really doing their job for them, is she?" Michelle whispered to me as we passed her in the lobby. "She might as well be," I muttered, watching as Mom handed a couple their room keys with a flourish. And then came the cherry on top. On the second night, Mom knocked on our door with a bright smile and a suitcase in hand. "I hope you don't mind," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I gave up my room. Lovely couple needed it. They're on their anniversary trip. Such a sweet story. Michelle's jaw dropped. "You gave up your room?" "Well, of course. I couldn't just let them go without a place to stay. Besides, I figured it would be fun to bunk with you too. Like a little slumber party." I looked at Michelle, panic flashing across my face. Her expression was unreadable, her mouth a thin line as she stared at my mom. "Mom, this is our room," I said weakly, already knowing it was pointless. "Oh, don't be such a stick in the mud," Mom said, brushing past me and plopping her suitcase onto the bed. "I'll take the couch, of course. I don't want to intrude." But she already had. Michelle didn't say anything that night, but the look she gave me when we crawled into bed with my mom snoring softly from the couch said everything. I'd made a terrible mistake, and the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it. The next few days were nothing short of a nightmare. Mom was everywhere, hovering, questioning, and inserting herself into every single moment. She clung to us like a shadow, a smothering presence that drained all the joy out of what was supposed to be the most romantic trip of our lives. It started with small interruptions. She'd show up at breakfast, plopping herself down at our table uninvited. "Good morning, lovebirds," she'd chirp, digging into a plate of croissants before we could even order. It didn't matter that Michelle and I had been mid-conversation or that we'd specifically told her we wanted some alone time. By lunch, she decided to join us on our excursions, waddling behind us on the beach with an oversized hat and a clipboard she'd somehow acquired. "Don't mind me," she'd say. "I'm just here to document your honeymoon memories." As if we needed her taking notes and snapping blurry photos while we tried to enjoy the sunset. But it didn't stop there. No, Mom had to make things personal. By the third day, it felt like she was mocking us, or worse, taking revenge for some imagined slight. She made passive-aggressive comments about Michelle's swimsuit choices, loudly questioning why she wasn't dressing for the occasion like the other women on the beach. At dinner, she critiqued the wine Michelle ordered, claiming it was too dry and that I should have been the one to choose. A man should lead, not let his wife pick the drinks, she said, smirking as Michelle's jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. And then there were the suggestions. You know, Mom began one morning, leaning conspiratorially across the breakfast table. If you're trying for a baby, and I'm sure you are, on a honeymoon like this, you might want to consider certain positions. They say missionary is reliable, but really, it's about angle. I have books on this back home. Mom. I snapped, my face flushing red. Michelle's fork hit her plate with a loud clang, her expression teetering between fury and disbelief. What? Mom said, feigning innocence. I'm just trying to help. You'll thank me when you're holding my grandchild. By the time we got back to our room that evening, Michelle was ready to explode. She's doing this on purpose, she hissed, pacing the room. No one is this clueless. She knows exactly what she's doing, and you're letting her get away with it. I wanted to defend myself, but what could I say? She was right. My mom had bulldozed her way into our honeymoon, into our lives, and I hadn't done a damn thing to stop her. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, she disappeared. It happened on the 4th day. Mom was suddenly nowhere to be found. No surprise breakfast appearances, no intrusive commentary, nothing. At first, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe she'd finally realized she'd crossed a line. Maybe she'd decided to give us some space. But as the hours passed, relief turned to worry. Michelle, however, wasn't concerned. Let her stew, she said flatly, flipping through a magazine. Maybe she finally got the hint. Still, something didn't sit right with me. Mom didn't just disappear without making it someone else's problem. We asked the staff if they'd seen her, but no one had any answers. Finally, one of the maids mentioned that her room was locked, and there was an odd smell coming from inside. That's when we saw it. Smoke, faint but unmistakable, seeping from under the door. Panic gripped me as I pounded on the door, shouting her name. There was no response. Resort staff rushed to unlock it, and when the door finally swung open, the scene inside was something out of a nightmare. The room was hazy with smoke, the sharp tang of alcohol hanging in the air. Scented candles littered the floor, their wax pooling dangerously close to the heavy curtains that were now fully ablaze. In the middle of the chaos were two figures, my mother and the concierge. They were sprawled across the bed, both clearly passed out, empty bottles scattered around them like grotesque party favors. Mom! I shouted, rushing into the room. She didn't stir. It was the staff who acted quickly, dousing the flames and pulling both my mother and the concierge to safety. They reeked of smoke and cheap liquor, their faces pale and lifeless as they were dragged out onto the balcony for fresh air. I stood there, shaking with a mix of fear, rage, and disgust. This was it. This was the culmination of everything. Her drinking, her selfishness, her complete inability to respect anyone else's boundaries. Michelle stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face hard as stone. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave me said it all. This is what happens when you let her control your life. For a moment, I didn't know whether to cry or scream. The staff asked me questions I could barely answer. Was she okay? Was I okay? But I wasn't. When Mom finally came to, coughing and pale, I was standing over her, arms crossed, trying to rein in every ounce of frustration I felt. Smoke still clung to her hair, and her eyes were bloodshot, not from the smoke, but from the alcohol. The concierge, equally dazed and thoroughly embarrassed, was being quietly ushered away by the resort staff, who shot me wary glances as they left. But Mom, she didn't have a single ounce of shame. I wanted to teach him, she croaked, her voice hoarse but defiant. The concierge. I wanted to teach him the right taste. For wine and for women. I stared at her, stunned into silence. What is wrong with you, Mom? I finally snapped, my voice shaking. You could have died. Both of you could have died. She waved a limp hand at me, as though dismissing my concern. Oh, don't be dramatic. It was just a little smoke. Michelle was standing nearby, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. She hadn't said much since we pulled Mom out of the room, but I could see the tension in her posture, the barely contained anger in her clenched jaw. And then Mom turned to her. "What can you have that I can't?" she demanded, her voice rising despite her obvious exhaustion. "What's so special about you, huh? A husband, a honeymoon, a future. I used to have all of that, you know." "Mom, stop," I said, but she wasn't listening. "I'm lonely," she said, her voice cracking. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time in years, she looked vulnerable. "Human. It's because I'm lonely. Nobody needs me. I have no grandchildren, no husband, no children. I have nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Michelle stepped forward then, surprising both of us. She knelt beside Mom, gently taking her hand. "That's not true," she said softly. Mom blinked at her, caught off guard. "You have us," Michelle continued. "You'll always have us. But you can't keep doing this to yourself, or to us." For a moment, the room was quiet except for the sound of Mom's shallow breathing. Then she nodded, just barely, and burst into tears. The days that followed were hard, but they were a turning point. Michelle and I sat down with Mom and talked, really talked, for the first time in years. She admitted things I never thought I'd hear from her, things about how lost she'd felt since I moved out, how much she missed the days when she felt needed. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted one evening, her voice small. "You don't have to do it alone," Michelle said. "We'll help you." And we did. We found a good psychologist for her, someone who was patient but firm, someone who knew how to break through her walls. We also found a clinic for addiction treatment, and after a lot of convincing, she agreed to go. It wasn't easy for her. Letting go of control was something she'd fought against her whole life, but she stuck with it. Mom began attending meetings and slowly built a new life for herself. She found friends who understood her struggles, who could challenge her without making her feel small. The change wasn't instant, but it was real. She laughed more, her eyes grew brighter, and the sharp edges of her personality softened just enough to let people in. A few years later, Michelle and I became parents. We named our son after my grandfather, the man who had inspired so much of Mom's strength and passion. When we told her the name, she cried, real, happy tears that reminded me of the woman she used to be before everything went off the rails. Mom doted on our son like he was the light of her life. She was happier than I'd ever seen her, not because she was in control but because she finally knew how to let go. For the first time in a long time, everything felt whole.